Hello, Professor Kupchan. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. Professor Kupchan, you're a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. From 2014 to 2017, you served as special assistant to the United States President and senior director for European affairs on the staff of National Security Council. So before we get started, can you first tell us a little more about your career trajectory? How did you end up at the forefront of the United States foreign policy?
Well, I began life as an academic. After graduate school, I taught at Princeton for a number of years. And then I had the opportunity to join the Clinton administration after Clinton was elected, worked in the National Security Council. And after that experience, I decided that I wanted to build a career that spanned the worlds of academic research and public policy. And so when I left the White House, I took positions at Georgetown and at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a foreign policy think tank and place for public debate. And it's really that effort to straddle the two worlds that has guided me. And then I fortunately had the opportunity during Barack Obama's second term to again serve on the National Security Council. Left the White House on Inauguration Day in 2017, and am back now as a professor at Georgetown and a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
I see. Thank you so much for that introduction. Next, I wanted to turn to a recent article you wrote. Biden's foreign policy needs a course correction, which I find super interesting. In the article, you argue that President Biden's characterization of competition in the 21st century as the clash between democracies and autocracies is a quote-unquote strategic mistake. I wonder if you can elaborate a little more. So what's the problem with drawing those ideological fault lines?
Well, I think that there are a number of drawbacks to portraying our predicament, the 21st century, as a clash between democracy and autocracy. First, it kind of risks creating a sense that we're headed back toward a world organized along separate blocks, that one set of countries are over there, the autocracies, one set of countries are over here, the democracies. Maybe we'll talk to each other once in a while, but effectively we agree to go our separate ways. Well, that's not going to work in today's world, which is interdependent and globalized. China is emerging as the world's largest economy. Its economy will continue to grow. It has a population of around 1.4 billion. And so there's no question that China is changing the 21st century, and it is engaging politically and particularly economically in most quarters of the globe. So there's no going back. There's no return to a decoupled world. Secondly, I think that America's allies are not spoiling for a fight with China. They do not want to see the drawing of new ideological fault lines. And as a consequence, I think they would prefer to work with Biden to deal with specific challenges posed by China and Russia and other autocracies, whether it has to do with human rights, whether it has to do with cyber or espionage or trade or stealing intellectual property, whatever it might be. Let's talk about it and let's deal with it. But let's not define this moment as a new clash of a historic nature. And then finally, I think in some ways, Biden risks strengthening China by trying to draw a new ideological fault line, in part because China's sources of leverage are about creating allies and working with others, Russia in particular. And so it seems to me that dealing with the rise of China should be in part about finding ways to reduce and contain China's leverage. And for me, that means also seeking to put some distance between Moscow and Beijing. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reasons that Biden is about to meet with Mr. Putin in Geneva is to talk about the possibility of not repairing the relationship with the US, but improving the relationship with the US and Europe, in part because of the desire to focus attention on China.
I see. Thank you for the insights. As you mentioned, this idea of alliance, and people will argue that, one major improvement of the Biden administration relative to the Trump administration is its emphasis on the importance of allies, right? So working with other democracies when it comes to standing up to China, so to speak. But as you mentioned, the appetite of our European and Asian allies to confront China may not be as big as ours. So the question is, how should the United States actually build a successful united democratic front, so to speak, if at all, when it comes to the question of China? How should we actually work with our allies?
Well, I think that America's strongest suit is its partners, its alliances, its international legitimacy, its ability to work with like-minded states in all quarters of the globe. I mean, China really has no real allies. I guess you could say North Korea, maybe. The United States has allies throughout Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. And when you think about dealing with China, it makes much more sense to try to forge a common front with those allies than it does to make an approach alone, to go it alone, as Donald Trump tried to do. And so I think that part of what Biden will be doing as he goes to Europe, as he sits down with democratic allies, is to say, what is a common ground? Where can we find a meeting of the minds when it comes to China? And I think there will be plenty of areas where there is agreement, including the repatriation of supply lines on sensitive technologies, semiconductors, for example, when it comes to speaking out against human rights and supporting political freedoms in Hong Kong or condemning the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Then there's the question of dealing with climate change and the need to work with China to reduce its coal consumption and its greenhouse gas emissions. So there are lots of areas where I think Biden will be successful in reaching common ground with allies. But for me, that's the way to go about it. What is the problem? What is the threat that China poses? What can we do to work together to meet those threats? That makes much more sense to me than sort of throwing the book at China and saying this is a fundamental, irreversible clash between democracy and autocracy.
I see. And when we talk about China challenge, one thing I frequently hear is this, economic coercion, which China frequently deploys against our allies. More recently, we see the case of Australia, and earlier we saw what happened to Norway and Sweden. So in general, what do you think the United States can do to sort of deter China from using those, economic weaponizations, so to speak, to deter or to, scare away our allies?
It's not an easy problem to deal with because China does use economic coercion for political and geopolitical gain. You mentioned several examples. There are other examples in Southeast Asia, in Africa, where where China uses its economic power for political leverage. And I think that the United States and its allies need to speak up against it. And they need to also point out that in the longer run, it's not in China's interest to develop a reputation for being a bully. China's influence in the world will grow if China is seen as a fair player that contributes to public goods. Take what we call wolf diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy. We'll give you vaccines, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. That doesn't play very well. And so I think in some ways it is in China's own interests to take a more pluralistic and a more measured approach to its trading relationships. And it's important for the United States and its allies to make that point very clearly to Beijing.
I see. And speaking of configurations of global powers, in a previous article, you argue for a global concert with 6 members, China, EU, India, Japan, Russia, and the United States. I wonder if you can elaborate on that model a little bit more. Why do you believe it's the best vehicle for promoting stability?
Well, we live in a world that is irretrievably interdependent and globalized. As I said earlier, there's no going back. We're not decoupling. There's too much water under the bridge. And so if you ask, what are the big challenges out there that we need to collectively take on? Climate change, pandemic and global health, cybersecurity, terrorism and extremism, trade, and a level playing field that makes more people prosperous. Those things have to be pursued in terms of broad-based cooperation across ideological dividing lines. And so for me, yes, let's have a G7 summit. Let's have a NATO summit. Let's forge common ground with our democratic allies when it comes to dealing with China. But, and it's an important but, what's most missing in today's international landscape is dialogue across those ideological dividing lines. We know how to work with democracies. We've been doing it for decades. What we're not very good at is trying to facilitate cooperation with countries that don't share our values. And so part of the proposal that Richard and Haas and I came forward with was to say, okay, let's create a forum where the major powers in the world are on a daily basis trying to negotiate, to compromise, to solve global problems. It won't be easy. They will have to agree to disagree on questions of domestic governance and human rights, but perhaps by compartmentalizing domestic politics from international politics, a concert of that sort could advance the effort to tackle global challenges. That's the spirit of the proposal.
I see. Thank you so much. And looking ahead a little bit, as you mentioned, President Biden will attend a series of high-profile meetings, to G7, to NATO summits, and also talk with EU leaders, as well as meeting with Russian President Putin. So what will be on President Biden's to-do list? And what kind of message will President Biden send to our allies and adversaries?
Well, I think for starters, Mr. Biden will want to enjoy a warm welcome. And democracies around the world, and in Europe in particular, are delighted that Trump is gone and Biden is in, because they see in Biden a familiar face committed to liberal democracy and committed to international teamwork. And the Trump era was very dislocating for many countries around the world. So in part, there will be a lot of smiles and backslapping and maybe even some hugs, but obviously that's not enough. You need to have concrete deliverables. And I see several at the top of the list. One is to move ahead on getting vaccines distributed into lower and middle income countries where the pandemic is still raging. That has to be a headline. I think you'll see discussions of climate change, new targets, new efforts to invest in green technology. There's already an agreement that seems to have been made about a global minimum tax, and that's a way of increasing government revenues, particularly in the United States. I think as we've been talking about, there'll be a discussion of Russia and China and what one can do to both deal with the threats posed by those countries, but also perhaps move the relationships in a more positive direction. I think one of the things that Biden will want to do over the course of the week is to draw connections between his domestic agenda and his foreign policy agenda. He's often talked about a foreign policy for the middle class, and that's in part because he wants to drive home to Americans the idea that what America does in the world, its engagement abroad, is good for the welfare, the prosperity, the security of working Americans. So I think you'll see a theme throughout the week of how international teamwork can make America more secure, can work to the benefit of America through jobs and prosperity, fighting climate change. One of the themes I think you'll see is this effort to draw connective tissue between what America does abroad and the domestic agenda at home.
I see. Final question of the day. So you worked for the Clinton administration, you worked for the Obama administration, and now you see the Biden administration's foreign policy. I wonder if you notice any changes across those three administrations, and what would you say is the biggest difference among those three presidents?
I would say that the biggest difference is that we now know that our own way of life, our own democratic systems are much more fragile than we thought. We've lived through a scary moment of illiberalism, of nativism. We still have a very large percentage of Americans who believe that Donald Trump won the last election. We see on the other side of the Atlantic similar stumbles. Britain has left the European Union. There are populist and far-right parties that are doing reasonably well in major European countries. And so I think what's new and most startling about our current moment is how much work we have to do at home. And that, to me, is why Biden is focusing on a laser on domestic investment, pandemic recovery, education, healthcare, infrastructure, getting this country back on its feet. We used to think about our main mission as dealing with external threats. Now I think our main mission is to make sure that the foundations of our liberal democratic societies are rock solid. We didn't see that coming, but it is now at the top of the agenda.
I see. Thank you so much, Professor Kupchan, for all the insights. It's such a great conversation, and thank you for your time. I look forward to talking with you in the future.
Good. It's my pleasure to join you, Lizzie.
Bye. Have a good rest of the day. Bye. Bye.